In a grand hall where noble daughters were sold like cattle, Lady Seraphina was worthless. Her own father put her on the block, but every bidder saw only one thing, the jagged scar that ruined her face. The price was an insult. Her fate was sealed. But when the doors flew open, and the most feared man in the kingdoms, King Theron the Wolf, strode in, he didn't mock her. He paid a king's ransom for the scarred girl no one wanted, silencing an entire empire with a single act. What secret did he see in her scar that would soon bring her enemies to their knees? The air in the great auction hall of Veritas was thick with the scent of spiced wine and expensive perfume, a cloying fragrance that did little to mask the rot beneath the gilded surface. From her position on the velvet-draped block, Lady Seraphina could see it all. She saw the calculated smiles of the lords, the predatory glint in their eyes as they assessed her. She saw the ladies, their faces masks of polite curiosity, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves, sharp and brittle. They were not looking at a woman, they were inspecting property, and she was the finest, most flawed piece in her father's collection, brought to market for one final desperate sale. She kept her back straight, her chin held at an angle that she hoped conveyed pride rather than defiance. It was a fine line to walk. Her gown of deep blue silk was meant to highlight her noble lineage, the crest of House Thorn subtly embroidered on the sleeves. But she knew the gown, the lineage, and the carefully composed posture were all invisible. The crowd saw only one thing, the pale, jagged scar that traced a path from her right temple to the curve of her cheek. It was a relic of a childhood fall, a mark of survival that this world had deemed a mark of ruin. Her gaze drifted to the front row, to the man whose ambition had placed her here. Baron Valerius Thorn, her father, did not meet her eyes. He stared straight ahead at the auctioneer, his jaw tight with a mixture of greed and impatience. There was no sympathy in his posture, no flicker of paternal regret. She was his last coin, his final gamble, and he was anxious to see her spent. The realization settled in her not with a fresh sting of pain, but with the cold, heavy certainty of a truth she had long known. She was utterly alone. The auctioneer, a man named Master Valerius, with a practiced, oily smile, began his speech. He extolled the virtues of her ancient bloodline, her education in the classical arts, her fluency in the high tongue. He painted a picture of a perfect, noble bride, all the while carefully angling his body to partially obscure the right side of her face. A pathetic and obvious trick that only drew more attention to what he was trying to hide. A true gem of Ethelgard, he purred, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous hall. A lady of unparalleled grace and breeding, ready to bring honor to any house noble enough to claim her. A suffocating silence followed his words. It stretched for an uncomfortably long time, broken only by a cough here, a shifted weight there. Seraphina could feel hundreds of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging the flaw in the otherwise pristine merchandise. The auctioneer's smile tightened at the edges. Her father's knuckles whitened where he gripped the arm of his chair. This was the first most profound humiliation, the collective, unspoken agreement of her worthlessness. Then a voice, cut through the tension, low and thick with arrogance. "I have a question for the lady." All eyes turned to Lord Malachi, a corpulent man whose fine silks were stretched taut over his bulging stomach. His face was flushed with wine, and his small, cruel eyes roamed over Seraphina with an insolent familiarity that made her skin crawl. The auctioneer hesitated. Questions from the floor were not standard procedure. "My lord," Lord Malachi pushed himself to his feet, a smirk playing on his wet lips. "Her face," he began, waving a dismissive hand. "A regrettable accident, I am sure, but one must be certain of the temperament of his investments. Has the disfigurement made her docile, or has it soured her disposition?" A wave of muffled laughter rippled through the hall. It was a low, ugly sound. Seraphina felt the blood rush to her cheeks, a hot tide of shame and fury. This was his goal, not to gather information, but to degrade her, to remind everyone that she was not a woman to be. Courted, but a thing to be questioned and vetted like a horse with a lame leg. She locked her eyes on his, her expression turning to ice. Inside, a cold fire ignited. She would not cry, she would not tremble. She would remember his face, his name, and the sound of this laughter. She felt a flicker of movement from her father's direction. For one wild, foolish moment, she thought he might rise to defend her honor, to rebuke the Lord for his blatant insult. But he remained seated, his expression shifting from anger to a cold, pragmatic calculus. An insulted daughter was better than an unsold one. His silence was a betrayal sharper than any word. Seraphina forced the muscles in her jaw to relax. She broke her gaze from Lord Malachi and stared at a point on the far wall, turning his cruelty into something small and insignificant. She would not give him the power of her attention. Let them laugh. Let them whisper. She would stand here, a statue carved from pride and pain, and she would endure. But as the silence descended once more, heavier and more complete than before, a new kind of fear began to creep in. What if the insult was the final word? What if no one would even deign to make a bid, leaving her to be cast aside? An object so broken that not even the most desperate lord would have her? The silence was no longer just an insult. It was her sentence. The silence in the hall curdled, turning thick and sour. Master Valerius, the auctioneer, wiped a bead of sweat from his temple with a silk handkerchief, his professional smile now a desperate, painted-on grimace. He looked from Lord Malachi's smug face to Baron Thorne's stony expression, then back to the silent, motionless girl on the block. He was a master of his trade, skilled in coaxing fortunes from reluctant lords for horses, jewels, and land. But this was different. He was not selling an asset. He was trying to dispose of a liability. Lord Malachi savored the moment, letting the discomfort marinate. He had become the center of this drama, and he relished the power. He finally took another ostentatious sip of his wine before setting the goblet down with a loud clink. "Very well," he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Since no one else is willing to show charity to the fallen house of Thorne, I will take the girl off her father's hands." He paused, letting the word girl hang in the air, stripping her of her title and her dignity. "I bid 20 silver pieces." A collective gasp swept through the room, sharp and unified. It was not a gasp of excitement, but of scandal. 20 silver pieces was the price of a pig at market, a pittance offered for a daughter of a noble house, no matter how diminished. It was not a bid, it was the final public stamp on her degradation. The offer was so low it served only as a statement, a final pronouncement that she, Lady Seraphina, was worth less than nothing. The laughter that followed was no longer muffled. It was open and cruel, an echo of the judgment she had feared her whole life. Seraphina's gaze, cold and steady, shot to her father. This was it, the ultimate test. The insult was not just to her, but to the name of Thorne, the legacy he claimed to hold so dear. She watched his face, searching for a spark of outrage, a flicker of paternal honor that would compel him to rise and thunder his refusal, to withdraw her from this farce and shield her from this final humiliation. For a fleeting second she saw it. A dark flush of shame crept up his neck. His eyes narrowed. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, extinguished by a more powerful force. Greed. 20 silvers were more than the 0 he had now. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He gave the auctioneer a single, sharp nod. The gesture was almost invisible, but for Seraphina it was a cataclysm. It was the severing of the final thread that bound her to him, to her family, to her past. The cold fury that had been a spark within her now turned to ice. A strange and terrible calm washed over her. The buzzing of the crowd faded to a distant hum. The opulent hall, with its gilded columns and jeering faces, seemed to fall away, leaving only the stark reality of her situation. She was adrift, a ship cut from its anchor in a storm. Her eyes met Lord Malachi's across the room. His face was alight with triumph, the look of a man who had not just made a purchase, but had thoroughly conquered and broken his acquisition, before even taking possession of it. She saw her future in his eyes, a life of casual cruelty, of being paraded as a broken trophy, of servitude to his every whim. She would be his to use, to mock, to discard. The thought did not make her want to scream. It made her want to fight, but the battlefield was gone, the war already lost. All that was left was survival. She would survive this. She would remember every face, every laugh, every moment of this day. And if a God was ever merciful enough to grant her a single chance, she would burn their world to the ground. The auctioneer, relieved to have any bid at all, moved with a sudden, desperate haste. 20 silver pieces from the noble Lord Malachi. Do I hear another bid? No? His eyes scanned the room, but everyone was merely a spectator now. Very well. 20 silver pieces going once? He struck the lectern with his wooden gavel. The sound was a physical blow. Going twice. Another strike, louder this time. It echoed the frantic, trapped beating of her own heart. She saw Lord Malachi lean forward, a possessive smile spreading across his face. Her father finally looked away from the stage, unable to watch the final moment of the transaction. In that moment, stripped of all honor and sold for the price of dirt, Seraphina found a strange clarity in the abyss. They could take her name, her freedom, her future. But there was a part of her, a core of iron and ice forged in years of quiet endurance, that they could not touch. It was the part of her that was watching, learning, and waiting. As the auctioneer raised his gavel for the third and final time, a single thought crystallized in her mind, a silent prayer to a God she no longer believed in. In that profound darkness, just before the end, her spirit did not break, it sharpened. She knew with a certainty that defied all logic that this was not her end. It was a beginning. Even as a slave, she would be a queen in the prison of her own mind, waiting. The world had cast her into the pit, but they did not know what she would become in the shadows. The auctioneer's arm began its final swift descent. The sound of the falling gavel was the only thing left in the world. Time slowed to a crawl. Seraphina watched the polished wood of the gavel descend, an arc of dark timber that would seal her fate. The air in her lungs seemed to turn to stone. This was it, the end of Lady Seraphina Thorne. Whatever came next would be endured by something else. Someone else, a creature hardened against the world. She closed her eyes, bracing for the final definitive crack of wood against wood. The sound never came. Instead, the great oak doors at the rear of the hall exploded inwards, slamming against the stone walls with a percussive boom that echoed like a thunderclap. A collective shout of shock erupted from the crowd. A sudden cold wind, smelling of pine and distant snow, rushed through the hall, guttering candles and sending a chill through the perfumed air. Every head whipped around to face the entrance. The auctioneer's arm froze in mid-swing, the gavel hovering inches from the lectern. Framed in the doorway stood a figure who seemed carved from the northern mountains themselves. He was tall and broad, dressed not out in the gaudy silks of Ethelgard, but in dark, hardened leather and a simple, unadorned coat of mail that had seen actual use. His face was all harsh angles and weathered lines, bisected by a scar far more intimidating than Seraphina's. A wicked silver line that cut through his left eyebrow. Flanked by 2 guards who were like mountains of grim-faced muscle, he was an image of raw, untamed power. Whispers spread through the hall like wildfire, hushed and terrified. It cannot be. The Wolf King! What is he doing here? It was King Theron of Vorlag, a man who was more myth than monarch in these southern lands, the subject of campfire stories told to frighten children. He was a brute, they said, a barbarian who ruled Aitowai, kingdom of ice and stone. His presence in Veritas was not just unexpected, it was unthinkable. He strode into the hall, his heavy boots making no sound on the marble floor. The sea of nobles parted before him as if he were a ship of war cutting through a fishing fleet. He paid them no mind. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed forward, locked directly onto Seraphina. She felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch, and a fear far colder and deeper than what Lord Malachi had inspired washed over her. He was not looking at her with lust or mockery. He was looking at her with an intensity that was terrifyingly unreadable. He stopped in the center of the hall, a pillar of dark, silent menace. The auctioneer, pale and trembling, finally found his voice, stammering, Your Majesty. This is an unexpected honor. We were just concluding a private—" Theron cut him off without a glance. His gaze remained on Seraphina as he spoke, his voice not loud, but a low, gravelly command that filled the entire space, silencing every last whisper. 1,000 gold coins. If the king's entrance had been a thunderclap, his words were the bolt of lightning that followed, splitting the world in two. A new silence fell, absolute and profound. It was a silence born not of mockery, but of sheer stupefied disbelief. 1,000 gold coins was a nonsensical sum. It was a king's ransom, enough to fund a war, to build a fortress, to buy the loyalty of 100 lesser lords. It was a price so far beyond the scope of the auction, so far beyond the value of any bride, that it defied all logic. Seraphina's mind reeled. She could not process the number. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing. She stared at the Wolf King, trying to find a hint of a jest, a sign of madness, anything to explain the impossible words he had just spoken. But his expression was utterly impassive, his eyes giving away nothing. Across the room, Lord Malachi's face had turned a pasty white, his jaw hanging open. The triumphant smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending terror. He looked from the barbarian king to the girl he had just tried to buy for pocket change, and his small mind could not bridge the gap. Baron Valerius was even worse. He half rose from his chair, his face a grotesque canvas of warring emotions. Greed lit his eyes at the mention of such a fortune, but it was instantly snuffed out by a wave of primal fear. This was not a business transaction. This was an act of power, and he was a pawn in a game whose rules he did not begin to understand. Why? The question screamed in Seraphina's mind. Why her? The girl with the ruined face, the daughter of a bankrupt house, the object of public scorn. Why would the most feared man in the 7 kingdoms single her out and place a value on her that was greater than the entire fortune of House Thorne at its peak? She had been saved from the gutter, she realized, with a dizzying lurch in her stomach, but she had not been freed. A golden chain was still a chain. She had merely been claimed by a different, more powerful master for reasons she could not fathom. King Theron took one more step forward. He finally tore his eyes from Seraphina to pin her father with a stare that made the Baron visibly flinch. "The girl is mine," Theron stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Have her brought to my chambers now." He did not wait for a reply. He turned, his dark cloak swirling around him, and strode back towards the great doors as silently as he had come. His guards fell in behind him, leaving a wake of stunned silence, shattered arrogance, and 1,000 unanswered questions. The entire hall remained frozen, all eyes now on Seraphina. She was no longer an object of pity or scorn. She was an enigma, a puzzle, a creature of no value who had just been purchased at an impossible price by a wolf in king's clothing. 2 of the hall's guards, their faces grim, began to approach the stage. Their steps were hesitant. They were no longer retrieving a disgraced noble. They were collecting the property of King Theron of Vorlag, and they were afraid. So was Seraphina, more afraid than she had ever been in her life. The walk to the royal guest wing was the longest of Seraphina's life. 2 stone-faced palace guards walked before her, and 2 behind, their presence a clear signal to the gawking courtiers. She was not a guest. She was cargo being delivered. Whispers followed her like a trail of smoke, the words 1,000 gold coins and Wolf King repeated in hushed, incredulous tones. She kept her eyes fixed forward, her posture rigid, a fragile fortress of dignity against a rising tide of terror. What kind of man paid a fortune for a broken woman. What horrors awaited her behind the door he had commanded her to enter. Every terrible story she had ever heard about the barbarian North swirled in her mind. The guard stopped before a set of heavy, carved doors and pushed them open, gesturing for her to enter. She stepped across the threshold, and they pulled the door shut behind her, the sound of the heavy latch clicking into place like the closing of a tomb. The room was not what she expected. Where Ethelgard's nobility favored gilded furniture, plush velvets, and ostentatious displays of wealth, this chamber was sparse, functional, almost monastic. A fire roared in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. A massive table dominated the center of the room, but it was covered not with wine goblets and platters of fruit, but with military maps, their corners weighed down with daggers. A heavy broadsword, its leather-wrapped hilt, worn smooth with use, leaned against the wall. It was the room of a soldier, not a king. King Theron stood with his back to her, staring into the flames. He did not turn as she entered, and the silence stretched, thick and heavy, with unspoken threat. Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs. She braced herself, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, waiting for the command, the cruelty, the first move from the monster of her imagination. Finally he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "The guards will not disturb us." He turned slowly from the fire. In the flickering light, his scarred face seemed even more severe, his eyes shadowed and deep. He gestured with his chin toward a simple wooden chair near the hearth. "Sit. You must be tired of standing." The simple courtesy was so unexpected it almost broke her composure. It was a courtesy no one, not her father, not the auctioneer, not Lord Malachy, had offered her all day. Wary, she moved to the chair and sat, her back ramrod straight. She would not show weakness. He remained standing, a towering, intimidating presence. "I have a question for you, Lady Seraphina," he said, his tone devoid of any emotion. "And I expect a truthful answer. How did you get the scar?" It was the same question Lord Malachy had asked, but the intent was worlds apart. This was not a public taunt. It was a quiet, direct inquiry. "A fall from a horse when I was a child, Your Majesty," she answered, her voice steady. She watched him, expecting a nod of pity or a grunt of distaste. Instead he gave a short, mirthless huff of a laugh. "A fall from a horse? You were lucky." He unconsciously touched the silver line that cut through his own eyebrow. "My first was from a dagger in a back-alley tavern. When I was 10, I was heir to nothing but my father's debts then." He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something beyond the cold facade. It was a flicker of shared understanding. "Vorlog does not fear scars," he said quietly. "It respects those who earn them and survive." He walked to a side table and poured 2 goblets of deep red wine, handing one to her. The gesture was so normal, so human, that it continued to unravel her expectations. "Ethelgard's politics are a serpent's nest," he commented, swirling the wine in his goblet. "Your father, for instance, he leverages his control of the southern wool trade to keep his rivals in line, yes?" He was testing her. The information was common knowledge, but slightly incorrect. The wool trade was a front. Her father's real leverage was in shipping tariffs, a secret he guarded jealously. This was her crossroads. She could be the meek, ignorant girl they all thought she was, and nod agreeably. Or she could show him the mind. He could not see. She chose to unsheath her only weapon. "You are mistaken, Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear and firm. Theron raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "The wool trade is a distraction," she continued, emboldened. "My father's power comes from the secret tariffs he imposes on all goods passing through the Crimson Sail shipping route. He manipulates the ledgers to hide the profits from the crown. It is this fund he uses to bribe his rivals, not the income." "From wool?" She spoke with the flawless authority of someone who had spent years observing, listening, and remembering every detail her father had dismissed as unimportant. For the first time since he had entered the auction hall, King Theron smiled. It was a slow, wolfish grin that transformed his harsh features entirely. It was not a kind smile, but it was a smile of genuine appreciation. "I see," he said, his voice holding a new note of respect. "It seems my spies are not as well informed as the Baron's daughter." He took a long drink of his wine, his eyes never leaving hers. "I did not buy a bride today, Lady Seraphina. I made an investment. I need a queen who can navigate the serpent's nest, because she knows where the vipers hide. I need a mind sharp enough to see the poison before it is served." He took a step closer. "I offer you a pact. Become my wife, my queen. In return, I will give you Vorlag's protection, its resources, its power, and with that power you will help me secure my throne from the political games of the South, and you will have your justice against the people who put you on that block today." Her answer was quiet, but it rang with the strength of forged steel. "I accept." The journey north was a baptism in ice and wind. As the rolling green hills and decadent country estates of Ethelgard receded behind them, the landscape transformed. Jagged gray mountains clawed at the sky, their peaks dusted with snow even in the warmer seasons. The forests grew darker and thicker, filled with ancient pines that stood like silent sentinels. For Seraphina, who had only ever known the gilded cage of the South, the raw, untamed beauty of Vorlag was both intimidating and, strangely, liberating. Each league they traveled felt like a step away from the woman on the auction block and a step toward someone new. Theron's stronghold, the citadel of the wolf, was not a palace, it was a fortress, hewn from the black stone of the mountain it was built upon, a jagged crown of towers and ramparts that seemed to grow organically from the rock. There were no frivolous gardens or ornate statues. There were high walls, thick gates, and watchtowers that promised a swift death to any enemy foolish enough to approach uninvited. The people within its walls reflected their king, pragmatic, reserved, and tough as the northern granite. They stared at Seraphina as she passed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She was the southern lady, the king's 1,000-coin purchase, an unknown quantity in their stark, ordered world. But Theron walked at her side, and his presence was all the protection she needed. He did not install her in lavish chambers to be preened and decorated. He took her to the heart of his power, his war room. It was the same chamber where they had first spoken, a space that valued function over form. Here, surrounded by maps of the 7 kingdoms and the quiet, watchful presence of Theron himself, Seraphina's transformation truly began. "Show me," Theron had said, unrolling a massive fresh sheet of parchment on the great table. "Show me the serpent's nest. Show me where to strike." For the first time in her life, someone was asking to see the contents of her mind, not the quality of her face. A fire she had thought long extinguished began to burn anew. She took the quill and ink he offered, closed her eyes for a moment, and let the years of quiet observation flood her memory. The endless, boring dinners where her father and his associates discussed their ventures. The ledgers he left open on his desk, dismissing her presence as he would a piece of furniture. The hushed arguments she had overheard through thick oak doors. It was all there, a detailed map of her father's greed. Her hand began to move across the parchment with a speed and precision that made Theron's ever-present guards exchange a look of astonishment. She did not sketch. She drafted. Lines were drawn to represent shipping lanes, circles for spheres of influence, names written to denote partners, rivals, and those indebted to him. It was a web of corruption, and she knew every single thread. "His power appears to come from land and titles," she explained, her voice gaining confidence as she worked, "but that is a facade. His true strength, and therefore his greatest weakness, is liquid. It flows through 2 channels." Her quill tapped one point on the map. "First, the Crimson Sail shipping route. He holds a secret majority stake through 3 proxy companies. It gives him control of nearly all the luxury goods that move between the southern kingdoms and the free cities. The tariffs he secretly levies are astronomical." She drew a line to a city on the eastern coast. "Second, his greatest debt. He financed the entire operation with a loan from Lord Kalin of Tyros, an iron magnate with a reputation for ruthlessness. The loan is undocumented, a gentleman's agreement, which means Kalin has no legal claim. But it also means my father cannot afford for the crown to learn of it, as it represents untaxed income. If Kalin were to believe his investment was at risk, he would become very aggressive to protect himself. He worked for hours, forgetting her exhaustion, fueled by a cold, righteous fury. Theron remained nearby, a silent observer. He did not interrupt. He watched her mind at work, seeing the brilliant strategist that had been hidden beneath layers of courtly expectation. He had her brought food and hot tea, simple gestures of care that spoke more than 1,000 flowery compliments. In the quiet intensity of that room, a new dynamic was being forged. It was not the relationship of a king and his consort, but of a general and his most trusted adviser. The fear she had felt for him was slowly being replaced by a profound and startling respect. He was the only person in the world who had ever seen her true self. Finally, she was done. She set down the quill, her fingers stained with ink. On the table before them lay Baron Valerius's entire financial empire, dissected and exposed. Theron leaned over the map, his scarred face illuminated by the candlelight. He studied her work for a long time, his expression grim. "A two-pronged assault," he said, his voice a low growl of appreciation. "We choke his income here," he pointed to the shipping route, "and we spook his creditor here." He pointed to Tyros. "He will be caught in a pincer with no way to pay his debt and no income to sustain his lies." He looked up from the map, his gaze meeting hers across the table. The respect in his eyes was palpable. "You have given me the dagger, Lady Seraphina. I will now place it at your father's throat." He turned to the captain of his personal guard, who had been standing silently by the door. "Send a raven to Admiral Vorlag. He is to begin naval exercises in the southern straits at once. All shipping is to be halted and inspected for contraband until further notice." He then looked to his spy master, a shadowy figure who seemed to blend into the corners of the room. "And you, send a message to Lord Kalin. A friendly warning from a concerned party suggests that Baron Thorne's finances are unstable. Let his own fear do the rest." The two men bowed and departed without a word, messengers of a silent, invisible war. The first move had been made. Seraphina looked at the map, at the web she had spun, and the trap she had set. There was no triumph. In her heart, only a cold, grim resolve. The silent vengeance had begun. The first reports trickled into the citadel like melting snow, small at first, then gathering into a steady stream. Ravens arrived from the south, their messages bearing the wax seals of Theron's spies. Seraphina and the king would read them together in the war room, the crackling fire and the howling wind outside, the only sounds as they tracked the progress of their invisible assault. The first message was from the coast. Admiral Vorlag, a man as blunt and effective as a warhammer, had followed his king's command to the letter. 3 of Vorlag's formidable ironclad warships had established a blockade in the southern straits under the guise of anti-piracy drills. They stopped every merchant vessel, their inspections painstakingly slow and thorough. Panic had erupted in the port cities. The flow of luxury goods from the free cities, the lifeblood of the southern aristocracy, had been choked to a trickle, and the Crimson Sail shipping route, my father's secret cash cow, was paralyzed. Seraphina imagined her father's fury. She could picture him in his lavish study, his face turning a blotchy purple as his portmaster delivered the news. He would be bellowing, blaming the incompetence of his captains, never once suspecting that the true cause of his misfortune was hundreds of leagues away, sitting in a cold, stone fortress beside a barbarian king. A small, grim satisfaction settled in her heart. It was not joy, but the quiet hum of a complex machine working exactly as designed. The second raven arrived 3 days later, this one from the east. The message was short and cryptic, just as Theron's spy master had intended. It confirmed that their anonymous warning had reached Lord Calin of Tyros. The iron magnate, a man whose paranoia was as legendary as his wealth, had reacted precisely as Seraphina had predicted. He had immediately dispatched his own agents to the capital to make inquiries into Baron Thorn's financial stability. "The serpent has been prodded," Theron rumbled, his eyes fixed on the map where a small iron token marked the city of Tyros. "Now it will begin to hunt." Seraphina traced the route from Tyros to the capital. "Kalen's agents will find nothing in the official records. My father is too careful for that. But their questions will start rumors. The other lords, the bankers, they are all vultures. The moment they smell weakness, they will begin to circle." Her prediction came true faster than she could have imagined. The subsequent messages painted a picture of a man being besieged from all sides. The rumors of Baron Thorn's instability, fanned by the whispers of Kalen's agents, had taken root in the fertile ground of the capital's gossip mills. A merchant guild, to whom he owed a small but significant sum, suddenly demanded immediate repayment. A rival lord, sensing an opportunity, made a public bid for a piece of land bordering the Thorn estate. Each was a small cut, but 1,000 small cuts could bleed a man to death. Her father, she knew, would be scrambling. He would be trying to liquidate assets, call in favors, and project an aura of confidence he no longer possessed. But his real source of power, the secret flow of gold from the Crimson Sail, was gone. He was a general trying to fight a war without a supply line. During this time, Seraphina's life in the Citadel found a new rhythm. She spent her days in the war room, her evenings in the vast, dusty library, and her nights in a chamber near the king's, a silent promise of the marriage to come. She was no longer just a consultant. She was becoming a part of the fortress itself. She learned the names of the guards, the histories of the northern houses, the legends of the Wolf Kings. And she learned about Theron. She saw him not as the brute of southern stories, but as a king who carried the weight of his kingdom on his shoulders. She saw the respect his men had for him, the quiet way he listened to the counsel of his elders. In the evenings they would sometimes sit by the fire, speaking not of war and vengeance, but of their pasts. He told her of his lonely childhood, of his fight to reclaim his father's throne from treacherous uncles. She, in turn, told him of her own quiet, lonely world, of a father who saw her as a ledger entry and a society that saw her as a flaw. In these quiet moments, the alliance of convenience began to feel like something more. The respect they had for each other's minds was slowly, cautiously, blossoming into a connection of their hearts. He would look at her, at the scar on her face, and she knew he was not seeing a flaw. He was seeing the woman who had survived, the strategist who sat beside him, the queen who was helping him secure his kingdom. One evening, a raven arrived bearing a message that made Seraphina's blood run cold. It was not from a spy. It was from her father. His seal, the proud wolf of House Thorn, was affixed to the bottom. The message was short, its tone a jarring mixture of feigned paternal warmth and thinly veiled desperation. He had heard of her betrothal to the great King Theron, he wrote, and his heart was overjoyed. He would be traveling north to the Citadel to attend the official betrothal feast and to give his daughter his blessing. She handed the scroll to Theron. He read it, his expression unreadable. "He is not coming to give his blessing," Seraphina said, her voice quiet. "No," Theron agreed, his eyes meeting hers. "He is a drowning man, and he thinks I am a lifeline. He is coming to beg." The final piece of the trap was about to fall into place. The serpent, wounded and cornered, was slithering directly into the wolf's den, and Seraphina would be waiting. The great hall of the Citadel was a study in brutal elegance. Unlike the perfumed, gilded halls of Ethelgard, this chamber was built to inspire awe, not comfort. Massive timber beams, dark with age, spanned a ceiling high enough to make a man feel small. The stone walls were hung not with frivolous tapestries of frolicking nymphs, but with the ancient, battle-worn banners of the northern houses, their crests telling stories of conquest and survival. A fire large enough to roast an ox roared in a cavernous hearth, casting a warm, flickering light on the assembled lords and ladies of Vorlag. Seraphina stood beside Theron's throne, a wolf pelt draped over her shoulders. She was not dressed in the soft blues of her former life, but in a gown of deep forest green, the color of the Vorlag pines, trimmed with black fur. Her hair was intricately braided in the northern style, and at her throat lay a simple, heavy silver pendant, Theron's gift. She was no longer a southern flower. She was being remade in the image of this harsh, proud land. She was its future queen. When her father, Baron Valerius Thorn, was announced, a hush fell over the hall. He strode in with a practiced, arrogant swagger, attempting to project an aura of wealth and importance. But Seraphina, with her newly sharpened senses, saw the truth. She saw the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the desperate way his eyes darted about the hall, not in admiration, but in frantic calculation. She saw the slight tremble in his hand as he reached for a goblet of wine. He was a predator who knew, on some primal level, that he had wandered into a stronger predator's territory. He approached the dais where she and Theron stood, his face splitting into a wide, false smile. "Seraphina, my daughter, you are radiant. The northern air suits you." "Father," she replied, her voice cool and even. She inclined her head, a gesture of respect so formal and distant it was more of an insult than a welcome. "We are honored by your presence." The feast began. The long tables groaned with roasted meats, dark breads, and strong northern ale. Baron Valerius was seated at the high table, a place of honor that seemed to magnify his discomfort. He tried repeatedly to engage Theron in conversation, his talk filled with mentions of mutually beneficial partnerships and uniting the great houses of the north and south. He was fishing, casting his line again and again, hoping to hook the loan that would save him from ruin. Theron played his part with masterful skill. He was a gracious host, nodding and smiling, yet his answers were vague and non-committal, his eyes promising nothing. He let the Baron talk, letting him expose his desperation to the silent, watchful lords of his court. Seraphina ate little, her gaze never straying far from her father. She felt a strange detachment, the calm of a general watching the enemy march precisely into the trap she has laid. Finally, the moment came. Theron rose to his feet, his goblet in hand. The hall fell silent. "My lords, my ladies," he began, his voice easily filling the hall, "tonight we celebrate a new beginning, a union of two houses, and the future of Vorlag. I ask you to join me in a toast to my bride, my partner, my queen, to Seraphina of House Thorn." "To Seraphina!" the hall roared back, and 1,000 goblets were raised. Seraphina's heart beat a steady rhythm. Theron remained standing after the toast. "It is a great joy," he continued, his eyes finding the Baron, "to welcome the bride's father, who has journeyed so far to share in our happiness. But before the night grows too old, my queen has a few words she wishes to share with him." He sat, leaving Seraphina standing alone in the sudden expectant silence. Every eye in the hall was on her. She felt her father's gaze, confused and wary. She took a breath, letting it out slowly, and then she began to speak, her voice not loud, but carrying a cold, clear precision that cut through the air like a shard of glass. "Father," she began, her eyes locking with his, "I wish to thank you. Truly, my life in your house taught me many valuable lessons. Above all, it taught me about value, the price of things." The Baron forced a confused smile. "I have always tried to provide you with the best, my dear." "Indeed," Seraphina said, her voice hardening almost imperceptibly. "You taught me, for instance, that the declared value of the Crimson Sail Shipping Company is the 20,000 gold pieces you report to the royal tax collectors, but its true value is the 75,000 you siphon away each year through proxy accounts in the name of men long dead. A valuable lesson in creative accounting." A shocked murmur went through the hall. The Baron's face went white. "Seraphina, what is the meaning of this? You are overwrought." She did not let him finish. "You also taught me about debt and leverage," she continued, her voice relentless. "You taught me that a secret loan of 50,000 gold pieces from the iron magnate Lord Calen is not a weakness, so long as he believes you are solvent. But what happens, Father, when your shipping routes are blockaded? And when Lord Calen hears a rumor that you are on the verge of bankruptcy and calls in his loan? What is the value of a man with no income and a debt that could see him thrown in a dungeon?" "This is slander," he sputtered, rising to his feet, his face a mask of rage and terror. "Lies from a bitter, ungrateful girl." "Is it?" Seraphina's voice was like ice. At that moment Theron made a quiet signal. His chancellor, a stern, gray-haired man, stepped forward from the shadows. He was carrying a heavy leather-bound book which he dropped onto the high table with a deafening thud that echoed through the silent hall. "The Baron's private ledgers, Your Majesty," the Chancellor announced, his voice devoid of emotion, "acquired by our agents in the south. They appear to corroborate every word my queen has just spoken." The air was sucked out of the room. Baron Valerius stared at the ledger, the physical proof of his ruin, and then at his daughter. The confusion and anger in his eyes finally melted away, replaced by a look of pure, horrified understanding. He was no longer looking at the flawed girl he had sold for scrap. He was looking at the woman who had orchestrated his downfall with terrifying precision. He was looking at the Queen of the Wolves, and she was looking back, her face a calm, unreadable mask of perfect, chilling justice. The silence in the great hall was a living thing, heavy and absolute. Baron Valerius stood frozen, his face a ghastly shade of white, his eyes locked on the leather-bound ledger that served as his tombstone. The proof of his life's deceptions lay open for all to see, brought to light by the daughter he had deemed worthless. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air, but no words came. There were no more lies to tell, no more facades to hide behind. King Theron rose slowly from his throne, his presence commanding the absolute attention of every person in the hall. He did not look at the sputtering, ruined baron. Instead, he addressed his court, his voice calm and resonant with unimpeachable authority. "In my kingdom," Theron began, "a man who betrays his sworn allegiances is a traitor. A man who steals from his own crown is a thief. By the laws of Vorlag, the punishment for either crime is death." A tremor of fear went through Valerius. He shrank back, his eyes wide with terror. Seraphina watched him, her own heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. She felt no pity, but no bloodlust either. This was not about his death. It was about the death of the power he had held over her. "However," Theron continued, his gaze sweeping the room, "we are not in Vorlag, and Baron Thorn is a subject of Ethelgard. I would not wish to insult my royal brother in the south by executing one of his nobles without his consent." A faint, dangerous smile touched Theron's lips. "So I must dispense a justice that is more fitting to the circumstances." He turned his gaze upon Valerius, who flinched as if struck. "As of this moment, all assets, titles, and lands belonging to the disgraced House of Thorn are hereby declared forfeit. They will be surrendered to the crown of Ethelgard, to begin to repay the debts of this man's treachery." Valerius let out a choked sound, the noise of a man watching his entire world burn to the ground. Everything he had schemed for, lied for, and sold his daughter for was gone in a single sentence. "But," Theron said, raising a hand, "my chancellor, in his diligence, has researched the ancient laws of Ethelgard." He nodded to the chancellor, who spoke in a dry, clear voice. "By the old laws, Your Majesty, when a noble house falls to dishonor, a legitimate heir may petition to reclaim the ancestral title free of the predecessor's crimes, provided they can personally settle the house's outstanding private debts." Theron's gaze fell upon Seraphina, and his voice was filled with a rich, cutting irony. "My queen, in her boundless generosity, has agreed to this. As the new rightful Baroness of Thorn, She will use the dowry I paid for her, 1,000 gold coins, to settle her father's private financial obligations. The poetic justice of it was so sharp, so perfect, it was breathtaking. The very money he had received for casting her out would now be the instrument of his final disinheritance, cementing her rise on the ashes of his ruin. He had sold his daughter, and in doing so had paid for his own destruction. As for you, Valerius, Theron's voice dropped the baron's title, rendering him a commoner. You are stripped of your name and station. You are an exile. You are free to leave my castle and go wherever you wish, with nothing but the clothes on your back and the hollow echo of your ambition. You may find that the world is a cold place for a man with no name, no allies, and no gold. As two guards moved to flank the now sobbing Valerius, Theron's eyes scanned the high table and landed on Lord Malachi, who had been trying to shrink into the shadows. Lord Malachi. Theron's voice was soft, yet it cut through the hall like a whip. Malachi froze, his face paling. I believe you offered a bid of 20 silver pieces for my queen, Theron said conversationally. He motioned to a guard who stepped forward with a small common leather pouch. Theron took it and tipped 20 silver coins onto the table, the metallic clatter painfully loud in the silent hall. A man of your station should not be made to suffer such a financial loss. Please accept my reimbursement. It was the most profound humiliation imaginable. He was not being punished, he was being dismissed. His attempt to buy a queen was treated with the same gravity as a drunken bid on a farm animal. Burning with a shame that was far worse than any physical punishment, Lord Malachi stumbled forward, swept the coins into his trembling hands, and fled the hall without another word. Seraphina watched the guards lead her former father away, a broken, weeping man stripped of everything he had ever valued. The great weight that had settled on her soul since childhood, the weight of his disapproval, his greed, his coldness, finally lifted. It did not leave a void. It left peace. Justice, in the end, was not a sword. It was a mirror, forcing a man to see his own soul and find it utterly bankrupt. Seraphina's silent war was over. The feast was concluded. The lords of Vorlag began to depart, leaving their king and his queen-to-be. In the vast, quiet hall, the public spectacle was over. Now only the private truth remained. Theron turned to Seraphina, the hard lines of the king softening into the face of the man she had come to know. "It is done?" he said quietly, his voice gentle. She met his gaze, the warmth of the fire reflecting in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "it is done." The air between them shifted, the pact of vengeance fulfilled, leaving a new unspoken space to be filled with something else entirely. The great hall, moments ago, a theater of judgment and retribution, fell quiet. The last of the northern lords had departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of wood smoke and the ghosts of their thunderous approval. Servants moved like shadows in the periphery, clearing away the remnants of the feast. In the center of the vast space, Seraphina and Theron stood alone, the silence between them no longer fraught with tension, but filled with the calm, quiet hum of a battle won. The public spectacle was over. The private truth remained. Theron turned to her, the hard lines of the Wolf King softening into the face of the man she had come to know in the firelight of the war room. The fierce intensity in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, gentle gravity. "It is done," he said, his voice a quiet affirmation. "Yes," she whispered back, the word feeling both small and immense. "It is done." The weight of her past had been lifted, leaving her feeling strangely light, untethered in this new, quiet space. He looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time without the shadow of her father standing between them. "There is one more thing you must see," he said. He extended his hand to her, his palm open. It was not a command but an invitation, a simple gesture that closed the final distance between them, bridging the gap between a king and his purchase, and creating a new one between a man and a woman. She placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and strong, engulfing hers completely. He led her from the great hall, away from the lingering memories of the confrontation, and through stone corridors that were older and deeper than any she had yet seen in the citadel. He walked them down a spiraling staircase lit by flickering torches, the air growing cooler, smelling of ancient stone and stillness. He stopped before a single, heavy door made of iron dark wood bound with black, unadorned steel. He produced an old, heavy key from within his tunic and unlocked it. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a circular chamber untouched by the castle's torches. The only light was a single, pure shaft of moonlight that fell from a high, narrow window, illuminating the center of the room like a spotlight on a stage. It was not a treasury or a dungeon. It felt like a sanctuary. The walls were smooth, dark stone, bare of any adornment save one. Covering the entire far wall was a massive, ancient tapestry, its colors muted by time, but its images still breathtakingly clear. It depicted a great battle, and at the heart of it, leading a charge of northern warriors, was a queen. Her hair was a cascade of spun gold, her expression fierce and noble, and there, woven in a shimmering silvery thread that caught the moonlight, was a jagged scar running from her temple to her cheek. It was identical to her own. Seraphina's breath caught in her throat. She took a step closer, her hand unconsciously rising to her face. "This is the heart of Vorlag," Theron said softly, his voice filled with a reverence she had never heard from him before. "The chamber of the first queen. Her name was Lyra. She was a warrior, a strategist, and a leader who did what no king before her could. She united the warring clans of the north and forged this kingdom with her own hands." He gestured to the tapestry. "In the final battle that secured our freedom, she was struck down, but she rose again, bearing that mark. Our legends say it is not a wound, but a sigil of destiny, that when Vorlag faces its gravest peril, a queen bearing Lyra's mark will come from an unexpected place, and her wisdom will be the shield that protects us all." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Seraphina's mind, forming a picture far grander and more astonishing than she could have ever conceived. The impossible bid, the instant protection, the title of queen. It was not madness. It was faith. "You saw the scar," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "At the auction. You bought me because of a story?" Theron turned to face her fully, and for the first time, the imposing mask of the Wolf King seemed to crack. He looked away for a moment, towards the queen on the tapestry, as if gathering the courage to confess a great folly. "I came south looking for a political alliance, a way to counter the growing rot in Ethelgard. I am a pragmatist, Seraphina, a soldier. I believe in steel and strategy, not in whispers from the past. My counsel advised me against even setting foot in that hall. I walked into that hall by chance. When I saw the mark the stories spoke of, I saw a sign, a desperate gamble." He stepped closer, closing the small space between them until he could look down into her eyes. "But the legend is not why I stand with you now. The prophecy led my eyes to you, Seraphina. But it was your mind that commanded my respect. It was your courage in the face of humiliation that captured my admiration." He stepped closer, closing the small space between them until he could look down into her eyes. "But the legend is not why I stand with you now. The prophecy led my eyes to you, Seraphina, but it was your mind that commanded my respect. It was your courage in the face of humiliation that captured my admiration." He gently, reverently reached up and traced the line of her scar with the tip of his finger. His touch was not one of pity, but of worship. "And it is your heart, the one you shield so fiercely, that has captured mine," he confessed, his voice a low, earnest whisper. "This is not the mark of a prophecy to me any more. It is the mark of the woman I have fallen in love with." In that moment, under the gaze of the ancient warrior queen on the wall, the last of Seraphina's defenses crumbled. This man, this feared Wolf King, had not just saved her from her past. He had given her a future she never knew how to dream of. He had seen all of her, the broken parts and the hidden, strengths, and had cherished them all. The transactional pact, forged in vengeance and strategy, had been consumed and reforged by the fire of a love that felt as old and as destined as the stones around them. She reached up, placing her hand over his, pressing his fingers to her cheek. Words were no longer necessary. In the quiet, hallowed dark, they were no longer a king and his queen-to-be, or a savior and his rescued maiden. They were Theron and Seraphina. And in the silent promise of their embrace, a new kingdom was already beginning to be built. The first snows of the next winter had begun to fall, dusting the black stone of the citadel and blanketing the northern peaks in a pristine layer of white. A year had passed since the day of the auction, a year since the confrontation that had shattered one world and begun another. From a high balcony overlooking the sprawling capital of Vorlog, Seraphina watched the delicate flakes drift down, a peaceful silence settling over the kingdom. The air was sharp and cold, but she did not feel it. A heavy wolf-pelt cloak, the one that had become as familiar as her own skin, was draped over her shoulders. A moment later, Theron stepped out onto the balcony to stand beside her, his presence a silent, comforting warmth. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. In the year since their betrothal feast, their world had been reshaped. The union of Theron's northern strength and Seraphina's southern cunning had proven to be a force that altered the balance of power in the Seven Kingdoms. With her guidance, Theron had navigated the treacherous political waters of Athelgard, forging new, equitable trade alliances that brought unprecedented prosperity to his people. With his backing, Seraphina had established new systems of governance, schools, and trade guilds, her strategic mind working not for vengeance, but for creation. She was no longer the 1,000-coin purchase. To the people of Vorlog, she was Seraphina, the archer, wise, the wolf queen, their queen. Children in the city would sometimes try to draw a pale line on their own cheeks with chalk, an imitation of the scar that was no longer seen as a flaw, but as a mark of royal wisdom and resilience. "A letter arrived from the south this morning," Theron said, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. "Lord Malachi has been stripped of his titles. It seems my reimbursement of his 20 silvers became the most humiliating joke in the Ethelgard court. His reputation never recovered." Seraphina allowed herself a small, faint smile. "And Ethelgard? Still reeling from the corruption you exposed. The king sends his thanks again. He says you did him a service he was too blind to do for himself." There was a quiet satisfaction in the news, but it felt distant now, like a story from another life. The burning need for justice had been quenched, replaced by the deep, steady peace of building a life. Her past was a closed book, its lessons learned, its ghosts laid to rest. She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the snow fall on their city. "A year ago," she said softly, "I was standing on a block, waiting to be sold." "And I was in that hall," he replied, his grip on her tightening, "making the most reckless gamble of my life." "Was it a gamble?" she asked, looking up at him. He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a love so deep and certain it took her breath away. "Perhaps, for a moment. I wagered a fortune on a legend. But I received a treasure beyond any price." He placed a hand gently on her stomach where a slight new curve was just beginning to show beneath the thick fabric of her gown. Their child. A new life, a new dynasty, born not of a cold political pact, but of a love that had defied every expectation. The woman who was sold for being flawed and the king who was feared for being a monster were creating a future together. A testament to the wholeness they had found in each other. They saw a scar. "Seraphina," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as he gently brushed his thumb over her cheek. "And they called you worthless. I look at this same scar every day, and I know that I am the richest and most fortunate king the world has ever known." She closed her eyes, overwhelmed with a happiness so profound it felt as vast and as quiet as the snow-covered kingdom before them. She had been saved not by a king's power, but by a man's respect, and in return she had given him not just her, mind, but all of her heart. He bought her at an auction to shock the world. But in the end, it was she who gave him a kingdom of priceless value. She was the scarred, the rejected, the girl no one wanted. He was the feared, the misunderstood, the king who saw her soul. Together they proved that the greatest empires are not built on gold or steel, but on a love that finds strength in what the world calls broken. If their story has moved you, subscribe now and become part of a community that believes in the power of seeing the crown that awaits within us all.